Hi there. So I'm going to confess there's something that triggers me. And it's the use of this guard where people are standing here with daggers or with one hand forward or just, yeah, here. But the point that triggers me is this hand here. Now, why does it trigger me? Well, I'm going to try to explain why I have so much against it. First of all, the first point is actually very easy and basically undisputable. And that is the simple fact that there's no evidence for it in any manual that I know of or treatise. So if we're talking about the medieval period, I don't know of any manual or treatise that deals with this, and that alone should kind of alert us, because dagger is one of the most well documented weapons in treatises and manuals. As if we just count about pages and ink spent on dagger, it's basically more than almost any other weapon. So if we can't find any trace of this guard being used, I think it's pretty fair to say that it just wasn't used. And I'm going to try to show why. Now, there are 2 points of contention here. 2 guards that sometimes gets referred to, and they're both from Fiore, that sometimes get referred to as maybe being this guard. I don't think that's very correct, and I think it's also kind of misrepresenting. But I'll show them so you can kind of make up your own mind, but I'll also give my points on why they're not the same. So, the first one is actually one where this hand holds a quarterstaff, and it's from the section on mixed weapons. And the person is standing basically like this, holding the or maybe even like this if you're gonna be a bit specific, and he's holding the quarterstaff in his left hand, defending with it. Now, first of all, that is a very specific context. It's a context where you have a quarterstaff and a dagger, and it's not really intended to be used against somebody else using dagger, because this is where this guard usually turns up. It turns up in the dagger versus dagger sparring, and people tend to hold their daggers like this. However, to my knowledge, it absolutely doesn't exist in that context. If you know somewhere it does, so now please inform me. I'll be thrilled to be wrong. But if you look at that, now I'm not a Fiorist, so there are people who know Fiore better than me, but I read these 2 sections, and one of them is, of course, as I said, dealing with mixed weapons. And the point about this is to use the quarterstaff as defending against, spears and swords and stuff like that, and then to be able to get in and use your dagger. Now, where would you use this? Well, because if I had a quarterstaff and a dagger, and that was what I was armed with, most of the time I would use the quarterstaff as most quarterstaff treatises and manuals deal with it, namely holding it in one end and utilizing its 2 biggest strengths, namely reach and power. And none of these get used when you're holding it like this. It's purely a defensive item. Basically, it's working as a shield. So that tells me that if you're not wanting to use the quarterstaff with its 2 main strengths, that probably means that you're in a tight quarters or somewhere. For some reason, you're unable to bring the 2 strengths of the quarterstaff to bear, or the situation otherwise is just you have to defend yourself more than more defense is somehow more important at that point. Now that's one of them. The other, what's good about it, I will say, is that it actually tells you to hold the hand, well, not really here, but kind of here. So that is, in my opinion, just a version of this, or a version of this, which you see in Meyer, where he holds it like this when he goes in and grabs somebody, and that's to make sure the dagger is offline from your opponent so that they cannot interfere with the dagger while you're grabbing the person. Now that would be useful as well, but nevertheless, could kind of look like it's in this area. I don't think that this necessarily is more of a stretch than this from this. The other one is what's called posta di longa. Now, posta di longa is a grappling guard. It's a guard where you're basically standing like this. Now, this guard exists in, I think, almost every wrestling or grappling system I can think of in the world still. There's nothing wrong with it. It's perfectly good. It's a good grappling guard. It's not a dagger guard. And even the people who try to say that this somehow is that is because what they end up doing is basically they say, yeah, but you can't hold your dagger like this because that makes no sense because you can't do anything here, just in the way. So then they put it back here so that they're able to land something, right? And then they're having this hand here as a protection. Okay, now maybe even they're kind of like rolling it a bit back like this. Now, in my opinion, first of all, that's not posta di longa. Posta di longa is this. I don't think it's this. Secondly, we can just because I have sometimes seen people do this guard here where they're having both hands. This comes from, I actually think, more like from boxing, and sometimes with the hand out. Now let's just examine, because having the hand here, I think that's actually better than having it out here. But let's examine this on its own merits. Okay, so let's just start with the hand. Okay, the hand in front, it allows you to block. That's good. Offhand blocks, they're abundant in dagger sources. However, most of the guards that you'll see keep your hands actually close to the body, either here, or you see if the hand is up here, then the offhand is kind of tight here, or down here. Now there's a reason for that, and that's what you're actually not, that's the problem about this, is that you're providing a secondary target, one that's closer to the opponent. And that's one of the pretty basic concepts, is you hit the target that's closer to you. So if I'm sparring somebody who's putting out his hand like that, I'm actually going to stay out at a distance and target that hand first, because that means that once I've disabled that, I've not only disabled his potential guard, part of his guard, but I've actually disabled that hand so he can't use his offhand blocks. Now I've taken away over 50% of his blocks, maybe. Okay. Now that would actually be good for me. Now, of course, you can say, but this is a bait. So essentially, what you're doing is you're baiting with this hand. So you want me to go for that one, and once you've done that, you kind of just trigger it back and throw it forward like this. Yeah, you can do that. But is it anywhere mentioned in any source that that's a use of it? Since this guard basically isn't mentioned, I'm pretty sure that putting your hand forward like this to bait isn't really mentioned either. But prove me wrong. Prove me wrong. I'll be happy. If it somewhere says that you should put out your hand like this so that he will try to hit it, and then you will go in to hit back. Now, mind you, if somebody put their hand out like this, I can target just the hand and stay quite far out. At the point where, if I was the person holding my hand, the point where my hand was contacted with the blade, that's when I would have to retract it and get it. That would put my hand more or less maybe in the position where it could hook the other person's dagger, but I would have to take a full step in order to be able to hit the person's body. And what did I really gain by that? It's like, yeah, even if it's not in a manual, it's still not a great thing to do. Even if it was in a manual, it would still be a pretty circumstantial and a bit of a gamble, because it means it bases itself on my bait and my reaction to the expected attack being faster than the other person. And that's not always the case. Several times I try to bait people in any kind of sparring, and actually I walk into my own trap. All right, so baiting in itself is a bit of a trap, but that's not the case. I don't have anything against baiting, but I don't think this bait is actually really described anywhere. So I'd be very, very, very skeptical to that. Now, let's leave that hand alone, because it's actually not the important part. Because if you're judging a weapon guard, which a dagger is a weapon, we should mostly judge it on the position of the weapon, because actually the weapon is the most important. So from this position, what does this bring to the table that I don't get from the guards that we know are documented? And again, dagger is one of the most well documented weapons from the medieval period in its usage. So what does this bring to the table that Oberhut, Unterhut, Mittelhut, Kreuzhut or Posta de Ferro or whatever it's called doesn't bring? The only thing that I can personally see and that I've kind of heard as an argument is that, well, it allows you to bring an attack that has low low telegraphing. From this you can attack with low telegraphing. Now, unless you know, in case you don't know what telegraphing is, it's kind of like without signaling, kind of without telling. It's like a bit of an invisible attack. Now, actually, I would say that from this position I can do one attack. I have one option that has relatively low telegraphing, and that's a straight thrust. So from this position I can straight thrust here, but as you see, straight thrusting with a dagger in this position, it's actually not super effective, because I come to this point and I don't know if you can see it, but if I'm here and I straight thrust, okay, I have it on, my point is on line, I'm struggling to keep my point on line here, okay? So kind of about here is where I can do it. Now remember, so this, okay, again, you can see my dagger here. It's not traveling super far, you see? It's traveling, what, 30-40 centimeters? Daggers are force-dependent weapons, compared to swords, for example, which if you cut with a sword, basically just having it in here and just bringing it forward, the mass of the sword itself and the movement kind of brings its own power into the cut. With dagger, this is not the case. You have to add something, okay? Now, Meyer has an option for this, because straight thrust is an attack, absolutely. And Meyer has this idea about calling one hand follows the other, where you actually put the hand behind to increase the thrust power, which is maybe perhaps why you see him doing this in Mittelhut. Well, we just put our hand out here, so then I have to put my hand back here in order to do that, and all of a sudden I'm not really telegraphing, am I? Okay, now that's the only attack that you can do from this position that isn't telegraphing. I'll get back to this attack in a little bit, because it's actually more problematic than I just described, especially from this position. So, okay, so I'm here. What other attacks can I do from here? Well, I can attack from above, can I? But the problem is, look, if I attack with a downward thrust here, this is very good if I'm attacking Gimli the Dwarf of Moria, because this is about the point where somebody who's about this size to me, without telegraphing, I can attack. So if I'm like an orc in Moria fighting dwarves, great. If not, I actually have to do this in order to get down, and all of a sudden I lost the perceived benefit of not telegraphing. Okay, can I do any other attack? Well, yeah, I can get in from this side, but again, it's force dependent. So by the time I've generated any force, Now, I don't know if you see this, but see here, by the time I generate any force, I'm actually here. That means I have to be attacking somebody who's kind of over here somewhere. Okay, so yeah, it's okay if I've stepped out and I do something like this, but is he really non-telegraphing at this point? Okay, can I do it from this side? Yeah, and then it comes with the same problem. Yeah, I'm here, I can attack from this side. It's short range, and at the point where I can attack, I have to hit somebody, I'm actually here. So I have to be somehow moved out to the side or be at very, very short range, at which point I, of course, have less space to generate power, and daggers are force-dependent weapons. That's not to say you cannot get anything out of that attack, but it's not a great attack. They're all like semi-rubbish, and one which is kind of okay, and only one of them is non-telegraphic. The other ones are highly circumstantial. So now I can do other attacks from this. They're just not very non-telegraphing. On the other hand, they're actually telegraphing more than I would do from this position. So I would be, I can attack, from below here. That will work. I can attack from above. It's just then I have to raise the hand, and then I become slower and I telegraph more. The same is I can attack from this side. It's just I have to bring it here first. I can attack getting in this side, but I'll probably have to, load the weapon all the way back here in order to get enough space to get into the position and actually deliver enough force. That's just about delivering force. So from a just biomechanical point of view, I have actually one choice that's kind of a little bit good with regards to telegraphing, and it's not really good. So and as the saying goes, if you have one choice, you have no choices. So actually this gives me some worse choices than I have here, and none that are better. And the same is with here, and the same is with here. Right, and there's more trouble to come, because if I'm here, you see, the length of this dagger requires, in order for me to really get a thrust, to get movement, I need to preferably be moving behind it and really thrust into it. Okay, that also means that when my dagger is here, all my opponent has to do at this point is he has to put his hand on the outside here or the inside here, and he's stopped all my attacks. Or even better, he can actually interact with the blade itself. Just push it to the side or push it to the side, and I cannot attack, which is actually impossible from this position, because unless he's very, very tall. So again, worse than the guards we do have evidence for. So I'm not really sold on this. Now there's even more trouble to come because the straight thrust, which is the attack that you could say is you can deliver from this, it will be of relatively low power, but in the face maybe you could get away with less power, maybe. The problem is most people who train with daggers, very often people use just the wooden sticks that are sawed off. Now they get a circle about this big, right? And the mask is a bit bigger and a bit flatter than your face. That means that this is quite easy to hit the mask with, whereas this has to quite be on point. If I hit this, nothing happens. I might, cut a little bit open, but it's not going to do a lot. I really have to have my point on, and with this it's actually relatively difficult to do that. It's not easy. So that's an inherent feature in the straight thrust. That's not specific from this guard. That's just a problem with the straight thrust with the ice pick grip. So again, it's not great. Now, the nail in the coffin, and for me, and what perhaps annoys me the most, is that having a guard here or here tends to lead to what I call hamster fighting. I know it's not a very, encouraging word, but what I mean by that is that people try to go boom, they go pam pam, boom boom, they fight like this, and they think that they're really fast, and they go and they spar like this. Now, the problem is there's zero evidence for these kinds of thrusts or this kind of attacks in the manuals. Actually, you could say, of course, that there are relatively few attacks comparatively. There's more covers and defenses than there are attacks. But we can look at the covers and the defenses that are presented in the manuals, and you can look at all of them if you like. They all seem to be focusing on heavy, determined, quite large attacks. So we can basically safely say that these small things like this were not things that they really worried about or that they dealt with. And what we have to remember, at least this is my my approach to HEMA, is that when I'm doing HEMA, I'm not just fighting or sparring with an analog for a historical weapon. No, I'm trying to recreate the martial art described in a treatise or several treatises or manuals. So I'm mostly concerning myself with Joachim Meyer, but I've studied BPL 3281, for example, in Rapier. I've done a little bit of Fabrice. So when I do that, I try to recreate, whether you choose one manual or several, I don't really care. But we're trying to recreate the martial art described therein, not what you think that real fighting was. Because martial arts training is the codified system that you use to train and prepare yourself for battle. It's not how you think battle was. So you have to kind of let go of that and see what's in the treatises. And okay, let's say you're following Fiore and it's mostly one guard, Posta di Ferro, I think. Maybe that's because, or maybe there's one more. Don't correct me on this because I'm really not a Fiore. Okay, so let's say you're following a manual that either, like Fiore, I think it has only one guard with the dagger. I would try to use that one. Or I would look at what other treatises and manuals we do have and say, well, okay, what guards are described therein. Now, of course, by adding something to the system, you're running the risk of creating an anachronism. There can be a reason that he chose only to include one guard or two guards or whatever it is. Or for Codex Wallerstein, there is no guards. There's no guards in Codex Wallerstein. It's actually very poor. The dagger is very few sections. But and this is the case for many books. They are just a collection of some techniques. The amount of treatises that actually are full on trying to teach you a whole art is quite limited. But I would look around to try to triangulate and look at other treatises, preferably from the same time period, and even better if I can find somewhere from the same area, or an area where I know that the teacher, the author of the manual, actually worked in or had been exposed to. Like, for example, we know that Fiore was in Germany. We know that Meyer visited Italy. So, and we know which parts. So we could kind of say that, all right, so they were exposed to these sources. And then you could find something there, if possible. But anyway, I think that adding a guard, or indeed a technique, from an outside source from the same period or same area, that is running the risk of creating anachronisms. But if you invent something on your own, that's not running the risk. That is intentionally creating anachronisms, and I think that's worse. I think that we as practitioners cannot completely avoid creating anachronisms, I think we should hold ourselves to as strict to be as strict as possible with this, at least when trying to recreate the art. I think that when you add something which isn't described in the manual, then you always run this risk, and sometimes it's completely unavoidable because, for example, in certain manuals, footwork isn't even described. So whatever you're doing with your feet is somehow based on, you know, not the manual, at least, even though it's maybe completely correct. This is why you triangulate from several sources. I think that's a better approach than to invent on your own. And again, the focus is to recreate the martial art that's described, not how you think that the fighting was done. And especially when we have not only have, sometimes we, like I said, we have, you know, lack of evidence, and I know absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, but when we have like this large corpus of knowledge about daggers from a time period of about 300 years, and from a relatively limited geographic area, parts of Europe, and they all completely exclude something, then I think we can say that this really wasn't really a thing that they concern themselves with. Or if many of them include something and then one doesn't, then it's not completely unreasonable to add that without running too much risk of creating anachronisms. So this was my point. I hope this wasn't just wild rambling, and that it makes sense, you know, that you understand why my reasoning for not really not liking people holding this guard, and that it isn't just, you know, being snobbish, and it isn't me just being focused on mire. It is actually a bit deeper than that. Okay, hope you enjoyed it, and see you soon. Bye bye.